Long before the Persian Empire carved its name into history, the Iranian plateau was home to scattered tribes, shifting alliances and cultures with deep roots in the ancient world. The story of Persia does not begin with kings or palaces, but with a slow and steady movement of peoples, Indo-Iranian migrants who crossed vast landscapes and laid the foundations for one of history's greatest empires. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, a broad group of Indo-European peoples began moving out from the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Among them were the Indo-Iranians, ancestors to both the Indo-Aryans of India and the Iranian peoples of what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. These migrations were not sudden invasions, but gradual movements shaped by climate, conflict, and opportunity. Linguistically, the Indo-Iranians belonged to the larger Indo-European language family. Their languages would eventually evolve into Sanskrit in India and Old Persian and Avestan in Iran. As they moved southward and eastward, the Indo-Iranians brought with them cultural practices such as horse riding, a warrior-based social order, and a belief system rooted in the worship of natural forces and cosmic order. One of the earliest Iranian texts, the Avesta, preserves traces of these beliefs and rituals. By around the second half of the 2nd millennium BCE, some Indo-Iranian groups began settling on the Iranian plateau. This vast region, bordered by mountains and deserts, offered both refuge and resources. Over time, these settlers split into distinct tribes, among them the Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, and the Bactrians. Each occupied different regions and developed their own identities, though they shared language roots and cultural similarities. The Medes, for example, established themselves in the northwest, in the area now known as Media. The Persians, likely a smaller and less powerful tribe at the time, settled further south, in a region they called Parsa, what the Greeks would later call Persis, and what we now know as Fars in southern Iran. These early Iranian societies were tribal and loosely organized. Authority lay in local chieftains, and society revolved around clan loyalties and kinship networks. Warfare, herding, and agriculture were central to daily life. Yet even within this decentralized world, the seeds of empire were being planted. Contact with older civilizations played an important role. To the west lay Mesopotamia, a land of cities, writing, and statecraft. Assyrians, Elamites, and Babylonians had long traditions of government and monumental architecture. To the east, connections with Central Asian cultures brought trade and exchange. The Iranians did not exist in isolation. They absorbed, adapted, and eventually transformed the influences around them. One of the earliest non-Iranian civilizations in the region was Elam. Centered in the city of Susa, Elamite culture had existed since the 3rd millennium BCE. Though Elam was culturally distinct from the Iranians, its proximity led to long periods of interaction. Elamite script and administrative practices may have influenced later Persian governance. In fact, even under the Achaemenids, Elamite was still used as one of the empire's official languages. Meanwhile, the Assyrians to the northwest began expanding aggressively in the 1st millennium BCE. As the Assyrian Empire pushed eastward, it encountered Iranian tribes in the Zagros Mountains. These early confrontations shaped the political environment of the time. The Medes, in particular, emerged as a confederation of tribes strong enough to challenge Assyrian rule. The Assyrians recorded campaigns against the Medes, describing them as formidable mountain warriors. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Medes were becoming increasingly organized. According to later sources, they had formed a kingdom by the 7th century BCE, with a capital at Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan. The historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, claimed that a leader named Darius united the Median tribes and built the first Median state. While details remain debated by scholars, it is clear that the Medes were developing centralized structures and regional power. The Persians, in contrast, remained less prominent. In Assyrian records, they are referred to as Parsua or Parsuash, living in a mountainous area on the southwestern edge of the Iranian plateau. They were seen as vassals or minor players, often overshadowed by their Median cousins. But they were not passive. They were learning, adapting, and positioning themselves for a larger role in regional affairs. Religion played a unifying role among the Iranian peoples. While many local variations existed, there was a shared belief in the cosmic struggle between order and chaos, a theme that would later be central to Zoroastrianism. Though the exact origins of Zoroastrianism are difficult to date, the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, likely lived sometime between the 2nd and 1st millennium BCE. His teachings would deeply influence later Persian rulers and shape the spiritual identity of the empire. Another important development during this period was the emergence of mounted warfare. The Iranian plateau, with its open spaces and rugged terrain, was ideal for horse breeding. Iranian warriors became known for their horsemanship, archery, and mobile tactics. These skills would later become key to Persian military success. By the early 7th century BCE, the political map of the ancient Near East was shifting rapidly. At its center stood the mighty Assyrian Empire, a militarized and brutal state that dominated the region through force, tribute, and a well-organized army. But cracks had begun to appear in its foundations. And in the highlands to the east, a rising power was beginning to take shape: the kingdom of the Medes. The Medes, an Iranian people closely related to the Persians, had gradually consolidated their power in the northwest of the Iranian plateau, in the region known as Media. Bordered by the Zagros Mountains to the west and by Elam and Persia to the south, Media served as both a crossroads and a stronghold. The Medes had once been a collection of semi-nomadic tribes, but by the 7th century BCE, they had formed a structured monarchy capable of challenging the region's superpowers. The early history of the Median kingdom is not well documented by contemporary records, but later historians, especially the Greek writer Herodotus, provide a framework for understanding its rise. According to Herodotus, the first true ruler of the Medes was a man named Deioces. Though his account contains legendary elements, it reflects a broader truth. The Medes were beginning to centralize authority under a single leader. Herodotus claimed that Deioces was chosen by his fellow Medes because of his reputation for justice and order. Supposedly, he built the city of Ecbatana, establishing it as his capital. Modern archaeological evidence shows that Ecbatana, today's Hamadan, did exist as a major urban center, although the scale of its early construction remains uncertain. What matters more is the emergence of a centralized government that united previously independent tribes. Deioces was succeeded by his son Phraortes, who, according to Herodotus, expanded Median power by subduing neighboring peoples, including the Persians. This detail is crucial. At this stage, the Persians were politically subordinate to the Medes, functioning as a vassal people. The Median kingdom, although still young, had already positioned itself as the dominant Iranian power. The Medes' rise took place during a time of growing unrest in the Assyrian Empire. Though still formidable, Assyria was dealing with repeated rebellions, overextended supply lines, and resistance from the peoples it had long oppressed. Among those enemies were the Babylonians, who had suffered under Assyrian rule for generations. It was during the reign of the Median king Cyaxares, likely ruling during the early 6th century BCE, that the Medes entered the international stage as a military force capable of reshaping the Near East. Cyaxares is remembered for reforming the Median military, organizing troops into distinct units based on function: spearmen, archers, and cavalry. This improved the Medes' tactical coordination and helped them become a match for the seasoned Assyrian armies. In a historic turning point around the year 612 BCE, the Medes formed an alliance with the Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nabopolassar. Together, they launched a campaign against the weakened Assyrians. The two forces laid siege to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and after a brutal battle, they captured and destroyed the city. This marked the end of the Assyrian Empire as a dominant force. The destruction of Nineveh sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. With Assyria gone, the power vacuum was quickly filled by the victors. The Medes gained control of much of northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, while the Babylonians expanded in the south. For a brief time, the Medes stood as one of the most powerful kingdoms in the region. The Median Empire stretched from the Halys River in central Anatolia to parts of western Iran. Its sphere of influence included various peoples: Armenians, Cappadocians, Persians, and others. However, the Median state, while expansive, lacked the administrative sophistication that would later define the Persian Empire. It remained largely a confederation of subject peoples held together by military strength and dynastic alliances. Cyaxares was succeeded by his son Astyages, the last king of the Medes. His reign, which likely began in the late 6th century BCE, would prove decisive, but not in the way he intended. Astyages inherited a powerful but somewhat fragile kingdom. Internally, the Medes faced the challenge of holding together their diverse subjects. Externally, their alliance with Babylon had cooled, and new threats were emerging. Among these was an unexpected challenge from a familiar source: their former vassals, the Persians. At this time, the Persians were led by a young and ambitious ruler named Cyrus, who belonged to the Achaemenid dynasty. He was the grandson of Astyages through his mother, Mandane, and therefore had both Median and Persian royal blood. According to later traditions, including accounts by Herodotus and Xenophon, Astyages tried to suppress Cyrus early on, fearing a threat to his rule. While these stories contain mythic elements, they reflect real political tensions. Cyrus eventually led a revolt against Median domination. The causes were likely a mix of personal ambition, tribal resentment, and a desire to unify the Iranian peoples under a different banner. The conflict between Cyrus and Astyages culminated in a decisive battle sometime around the mid-6th century BCE. According to Babylonian records, the Nabonidus Chronicle, Cyrus defeated Astyages and took control of Ecbatana. This was not merely a regime change. The victory of Cyrus marked the end of the Median kingdom and the beginning of the Persian Empire. It was a turning point in the history of the ancient world. The Medes, once dominant, were now absorbed into a new political structure, yet they did not disappear. Many Median nobles and administrators retained their positions under Cyrus, helping to form the backbone of the new Achaemenid administration. The fall of the Medes also brought about a new idea: that an empire could rule not just through fear and conquest, but through a more inclusive, structured approach to governance. Cyrus would take lessons from the Median experience, its strengths and its failures, and build something far more enduring. The fall of the Median kingdom cleared a path for one of history's most extraordinary figures to emerge. Cyrus, the Persian ruler who overthrew his Median grandfather Astyages, would not only unite the Iranian peoples, but also lay the foundations for the largest empire the world had yet seen. His rise was swift, strategic, and transformative, ushering in a new era that reshaped the ancient Near East. Cyrus was born into the Achaemenid dynasty, a relatively minor noble house within the Persian tribal confederation. His father, Cambyses I, was a local ruler of Anshan, a Persian city in southwestern Iran. His mother, Mandane, was a daughter of Astyages, king of the Medes. This dual heritage gave Cyrus both Persian roots and Median royal blood, an important factor in legitimizing his later claim to power. Although Persian tradition and Greek historians like Herodotus would later fill his early life with legend, visions, dreams, and secret upbringings, what is historically clear is that Cyrus came to power as king of Anshan in the mid-6th century BCE, likely after the death of his father. At the time, Persia was still nominally under Median control, but tensions were mounting. The exact circumstances of Cyrus's revolt against Astyages remain debated, but Babylonian records, particularly the Nabonidus Chronicle, confirm that by the mid-55th century BCE, Cyrus had launched a campaign against the Median king. The conflict likely involved both military confrontation and internal dissent within the Median elite. Herodotus writes that Harpagus, a Median general, defected to Cyrus, helping to swing the outcome of the decisive battle. Astyages was defeated and captured. Rather than destroy the Median political structure, Cyrus incorporated it. He made Ecbatana one of his capitals and retained many former Median officials in his administration. In doing so, he preserved continuity while asserting Persian supremacy. This decision not only stabilized the region, but also showcased Cyrus's pragmatic and inclusive approach to rule, an approach that would define the new empire. With the Medes now under Persian control, Cyrus turned outward. His ambitions were not limited to unifying Iran. Over the next decade, he led a series of campaigns that brought vast new territories into the Persian fold, expanding the realm far beyond its original heartland. The first major conquest was the Lydian kingdom in western Anatolia. Lydia, under its wealthy king Croesus, had grown powerful and prosperous. Croesus ruled from Sardis, a city famous for its wealth and luxury. He had formed alliances with Babylon, Egypt, and Sparta, perhaps underestimating the speed and reach of Cyrus's new power. In what is believed to be the mid-54th century BCE, Cyrus led his army westward into Anatolia. The campaign was swift and effective. After an initial battle at the river Halys, known as the Battle of Pteria, Croesus retreated to Sardis, expecting to regroup and renew the fight in the following spring. However, Cyrus pressed forward immediately, catching the Lydians off guard. The siege of Sardis lasted only a short time. The city fell, and Croesus was captured. The conquest of Lydia was more than a military victory. It gave Persia control over the Ionian Greek cities along the Aegean coast, setting the stage for future conflict between Persia and the Greek world. It also brought vast riches into the empire and demonstrated the effectiveness of Cyrus's strategy, rapid campaigning, respect for local traditions, and the integration of conquered peoples rather than their destruction. With the West secured, Cyrus next turned his attention eastward, campaigning into Central Asia. Here, the challenge was not powerful kingdoms, but decentralized and often nomadic peoples. One of the most notable confrontations occurred with the Massagetæ, a tribal confederation east of the Caspian Sea, ruled by Queen Tomyris. Accounts of this campaign vary, with some suggesting that Cyrus was killed in battle against the Massagetæ. Others, like the Greek historian Ctesias, offer different versions. What is historically certain is that Cyrus conducted extensive campaigns in the east, extending Persian influence into regions such as Sogdiana, Bactria, and beyond. However, perhaps the most important conquest of Cyrus's reign was the capture of Babylon. By the early 55th century BCE, Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, a king whose religious policies and long absences from the capital had alienated much of the priesthood and urban elite. The empire was still rich and influential, but it was vulnerable. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched into Mesopotamia. According to the Cyrus Cylinder, an inscription often considered the first declaration of human rights, Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He claimed to have been chosen by Marduk, the chief Babylonian deity, to restore order and piety. The Persian army entered Babylon with minimal resistance. Nabonidus was deposed, and Cyrus took control of one of the ancient world's most storied cities. Importantly, he respected Babylonian customs, restored temples, and allowed displaced peoples, such as the Jews, who had been exiled by the Babylonians, to return to their homelands. These policies earned him a reputation for tolerance and justice, further enhancing his legitimacy. Cyrus now ruled a vast empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. But unlike the empires that came before, his was not built on constant fear or chaos. Instead, it rested on a vision of kingship that blended strength with moderation. He did not attempt to impose Persian culture on conquered peoples. Instead, he allowed local customs, languages, and religions to continue as long as loyalty to the central authority was maintained. This approach required careful management. Cyrus introduced administrative practices that would later be refined by his successors, appointing satraps or provincial governors, developing roads and communication networks, and implementing systems of taxation and tribute. Though still in their early stages during his reign, these systems allowed a diverse empire to function as a coherent whole. Cyrus the Great died in battle around 529 BCE, likely in the eastern part of the empire. His body was buried at Pasargadae in a simple but elegant tomb that can still be seen today. According to later sources, the tomb bore an inscription that read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not grudge me this bit of earth that covers my body." Though brief, Cyrus's reign was revolutionary. He was not just a conqueror, he was a state builder. He set the tone for Persian governance for centuries to come, pragmatic, inclusive, and highly organized. His legacy would be revered by Persians, respected by Greeks, and admired even by modern thinkers centuries later. With the death of Cyrus the Great, around the year 529 BCE, the Persian Empire passed into the hands of his son, Cambyses II. The transition marked a new phase in the empire's expansion. Where Cyrus had focused on unification and strategy, Cambyses was driven by conquest. His most famous and ambitious campaign would take him into the heart of Africa, Egypt, the land of the pharaohs. Cambyses inherited a vast and relatively stable empire. However, as with all empires, stability required constant attention. Before he could pursue any external campaigns, Cambyses needed to secure his position at home. This meant consolidating his authority across the Persian elite, appeasing loyal satraps, and ensuring that the military remained firmly under his command. There is little evidence of internal unrest at the beginning of Cambyses's reign, suggesting that the succession was relatively smooth. Cambyses had already served as a crown prince and may have co-ruled with his father toward the end of Cyrus's life. This early experience, combined with his royal lineage, gave him the credentials needed to lead. His first major objective was Egypt, a wealthy and strategically important kingdom that had remained outside Persian control. Egypt had once been among the most powerful states in the ancient world, but by the 6th century BCE, its influence had waned. The ruling dynasty, the 26th dynasty based in Sais, faced growing pressure from both internal factions and foreign rivals. The Egyptian pharaoh at the time was Psamtik III, a young and relatively inexperienced ruler who had come to the throne only recently. His father, Amasis, had maintained cordial diplomatic relations with Cyrus the Great, but after Amasis's death, those relations began to unravel. According to Herodotus, Cambyses used a combination of military force and strategic alliances to prepare for his Egyptian campaign. One of the key factors in the success of the Persian invasion was naval power. Persia itself had little maritime tradition, but Cambyses formed alliances with coastal peoples, such as the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, who provided ships and seafaring expertise. This gave Cambyses a significant logistical advantage, allowing him to transport troops and supplies across the eastern Mediterranean. Cambyses also secured cooperation from Arab tribes in the Sinai Peninsula, who helped supply water and provisions for the desert crossing. This was critical, as the route into Egypt from the east was harsh and unforgiving. Without local support, the campaign would have been far more difficult. In 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his invasion. The decisive confrontation took place near the city of Pelusium, at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. According to Herodotus and later sources, Cambyses employed a clever psychological tactic. He ordered his troops to carry images of cats and other animals sacred to the Egyptians, believing that the Egyptian soldiers would hesitate to fight for fear of offending their gods. Whether or not this specific tactic was truly used, the battle ended in a Persian victory. Psamtik III fled, but was soon captured and brought before Cambyses. Egypt, once a proud and independent kingdom, now became a province of the Persian Empire. Cambyses took formal control of Egypt and adopted the title of pharaoh. This move was more than symbolic. By presenting himself as a legitimate ruler in the eyes of the Egyptian people, Cambyses hoped to maintain order and reduce the chances of rebellion. He respected traditional religious practices and offered patronage to Egyptian temples. He also appointed Persian officials to key administrative posts, blending local customs with imperial oversight. Despite these efforts, Cambyses's rule in Egypt was not universally welcomed. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, and his reputation in Egyptian sources is far less favorable than in Persian or Greek accounts. Some Egyptian records portray Cambyses as disrespectful and impious, accusing him of desecrating sacred sites and executing priests. These claims may reflect genuine tensions, or they may have been exaggerated by later writers opposed to foreign rule. Beyond Egypt, Cambyses reportedly planned further campaigns into Nubia and the Siwa Oasis, aiming to expand Persian control deeper into Africa. However, these expeditions met with limited success. The harsh terrain, logistical difficulties, and unreliable local support hindered Persian advances. One force sent toward the Siwa Oasis is said to have vanished in a sandstorm, though this account remains unconfirmed. While Cambyses was in Egypt, events back in Persia took a dramatic and unexpected turn. In 522 BCE, news reached Cambyses that a man claiming to be his brother Bardia, also known in Greek sources as Smerdis, had seized the throne. According to the official Persian version of events, Cambyses had secretly ordered Bardia's death before leaving for Egypt, fearing that his brother might challenge his authority. The man who now claimed the throne, according to this narrative, was an impostor named Gaumata, a Magian priest posing as Bardia. The sudden rise of this so-called false Bardia triggered a crisis. Cambyses began a journey back to Persia to reclaim power, but he died en route under mysterious circumstances. Some accounts suggest he suffered an accidental wound from his own sword. Others hint at suicide or assassination. Whatever the truth, his death left the empire in chaos. The reign of Cambyses was short but consequential. He had expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent yet, bringing Egypt into the imperial fold and reinforcing Persian dominance across the known world. But he had also left behind instability, unresolved tensions, and a dangerous power vacuum. The Persian Empire stood at a crossroads in the year 522 BCE. Cambyses II was dead, possibly by his own hand. An unknown man claiming to be Bardia, the son of Cyrus the Great, now sat on the throne. Across the empire, satraps and local leaders were uncertain, some declaring loyalty, others preparing to rebel. The unity that Cyrus had built and Cambyses had stretched was on the verge of unraveling. In this moment of uncertainty, a figure emerged who would not only restore the empire's stability, but take it to new heights. His name was Darius, known to history as Darius the Great. Though not a direct son of Cyrus, Darius would prove himself a master of organization, vision, and imperial governance. Under his leadership, Persia would become not just large, but efficient, wealthy, and truly imperial in structure. Darius came from a noble Persian family and belonged to the Achaemenid lineage, though from a junior branch. His father, Hystaspes, had been governor of Parthia under Cyrus. Darius himself had served in the royal court, likely as a member of the king's guard, the elite corps known as the Immortals. He was in Egypt when Cambyses died and returned to Persia as the political crisis escalated. According to Darius's own account, inscribed on the great Behistun inscription carved into a cliffside in western Iran, the man claiming to be Bardia was actually an impostor named Gaumata. Darius, along with 6 Persian nobles, assassinated him and seized power. The Behistun inscription presents this as a noble act of restoration, defending the true line of kings and eliminating a usurper. Modern historians debate the full truth of this account. It is possible that the real Bardia had been murdered in secret, and that Gaumata's only crime was claiming his rightful place. Regardless, Darius used this story to justify his takeover, asserting divine support from Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. Darius's first challenge was not legitimacy, it was survival. The empire erupted in revolts from all directions. In Elam, Babylon, Media, and beyond, local rulers declared independence or allegiance to other claimants. In the space of 1 year, Darius and his generals fought 19 battles to suppress these uprisings. Each victory was recorded in the Behistun inscription, where Darius details the names of the rebels, their territories, and how they were defeated. By sheer force of arms and political maneuvering, Darius brought the empire back under control. but he knew that brute strength alone would not keep it unified. What he built next was a lasting administrative structure, one that would define Persian imperialism for generations. Darius divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. These governors were usually members of Persian nobility, trusted to collect tribute, maintain order, and report back to the king. To prevent rebellion or corruption, Darius ensured that each satrap had a network of royal inspectors and military officials loyal directly to the throne. This system, described by the Greeks as the king's eyes and ears, allowed the central government to monitor distant regions effectively. Tribute collection was standardized under Darius. Each satrapy was assigned a specific amount to pay annually, often in silver, horses, or agricultural products. The system not only stabilized the economy, but allowed the state to plan expenditures and maintain a standing army. Herodotus lists 20 satrapies in total, stretching from Libya to the Indus Valley. To support this vast system, Darius invested heavily in infrastructure. He ordered the construction of the Royal Road, a massive network connecting Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Persia. This road stretched over 1,500 miles and included rest stations, relay posts, and security patrols. Messages could now travel across the empire in mere days, an innovation that enhanced administration, trade, and military readiness. Coinage was another of Darius's reforms. While earlier Persian rulers accepted tribute in various forms, Darius introduced a standardized gold coin called the daric, along with a silver equivalent. These coins bore the image of the king as an archer and were accepted across the empire. The creation of a common currency helped stimulate trade and unify the economy across regions with diverse systems of measurement and value. Darius also pursued monumental architecture. He commissioned a new ceremonial capital at Persepolis, a site carefully chosen and magnificently designed. Built on a grand terrace, Persepolis featured massive stone columns, carved reliefs depicting delegations from across the empire, and audience halls where the king could receive tribute. Though construction would continue under his successors, Darius set the artistic and symbolic tone. Persepolis was not just a palace, it was a statement of imperial unity. In addition to Persepolis, Darius continued work on Susa and Babylon, maintaining multiple centers of power and culture. He did not seek to erase local traditions, but to incorporate them into a broader imperial identity. Religiously, Darius promoted Zoroastrianism, though he respected other beliefs across the empire. The inscriptions he left consistently invoke Ahura Mazda, emphasizing the divine origin of his rule and the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. However, unlike later religious states, Darius did not impose Zoroastrianism on his subjects. The empire's strength lay in its tolerance and adaptability. One of Darius's most ambitious projects was in Egypt, where he ordered the reopening of a canal between the Nile and the Red Sea, connecting Egypt to the Indian Ocean trade routes. The canal, originally started by earlier Egyptian rulers, was completed under Persian supervision. Inscriptions along the canal's route credit Darius as the king who united two seas. His interest in exploration and knowledge extended to lands far beyond Persia's borders. Darius is believed to have sent expeditions to study the Indus River and explore regions of Central Asia. He understood that knowledge was power, and geography was key to both trade and military planning. Yet despite these accomplishments, Darius's reign was not without conflict. His growing interest in the Greek world would soon draw Persia into a long and costly struggle. In the late 6th century BCE, the Ionian Greeks under Persian rule revolted. The cities of Ionia, located along the western coast of Anatolia, had long chafed under imperial control. With support from Athens and Eretria, they launched a rebellion. Though the revolt was eventually crushed, it enraged Darius and revealed the vulnerability of Persian control in the west. Determined to punish Athens and restore imperial authority, Darius prepared a military campaign that would take Persia across the Aegean and into the heart of Greece. By the close of the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire had expanded to cover an immense and diverse territory. from the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. Under Darius the Great, the empire had become not only vast, but also administratively sophisticated, economically integrated, and culturally tolerant. Yet, despite its apparent stability, challenges were beginning to emerge at the empire's far western frontier. These challenges would spark a new and enduring conflict, the Persian Wars with the Greek city-states. The roots of the conflict lay in the coastal region of Ionia, located in what is now western Turkey. The Ionian Greeks had established colonies there centuries earlier, and by the 6th century BCE, cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna had become wealthy centers of commerce and culture. However, these cities had fallen under Persian rule following the conquest of Lydia by Cyrus the Great. While Persia allowed these cities to retain a degree of local autonomy, they were required to pay tribute and accept Persian-appointed tyrants, local rulers loyal to the empire. Over time, resentment among the Ionians grew. They viewed the imposition of tyrants as a violation of their traditional values, which favored self-rule and civic participation. The friction between imperial oversight and Greek political identity would prove explosive. The immediate spark for the Ionian revolt came in the city of Miletus, where the local tyrant Aristagoras found himself in a precarious political position. Hoping to strengthen his standing, Aristagoras launched a military expedition against the island of Naxos with Persian support. The campaign failed, and fearing retribution, Aristagoras turned against Persia and encouraged the Ionian cities to rebel. In the year 500 BCE, the revolt erupted. The Ionian cities expelled their tyrants and declared independence from Persian rule. Aristagoras, seeking allies, traveled to mainland Greece and appealed to Athens and Eretria. Both cities, wary of Persian expansion and sympathetic to fellow Greeks, sent ships and troops in support. The most dramatic moment of the early revolt came with the joint Greek-Ionian attack on Sardis, the Persian regional capital. The city was set ablaze, and although the main fortress remained in Persian hands, the attack deeply angered Darius. Herodotus writes that when Darius learned of the Athenian involvement, he called for a bow, fired an arrow into the sky, and vowed vengeance upon Athens. He is said to have ordered a servant to remind him daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." The Persian response was swift. Over the next several years, Darius dispatched forces to suppress the rebellion. The Persians regained control city by city, employing both military might and political negotiation. By the year 494 BCE, the revolt was effectively over. The decisive battle came at Lade, a naval engagement near the city of Miletus. Despite early promise, the Ionian fleet collapsed due to internal divisions, and the Persians crushed the resistance. Miletus itself was sacked, its population deported inland as punishment. While the revolt had been suppressed, the deeper conflict was just beginning. Darius had not forgotten the role of Athens and Eretria in supporting the Ionians. Their interference had revealed the vulnerability of the Persian position in the Aegean and posed a challenge to the authority of the great king. In response, Darius began planning a full-scale campaign to bring the Greek mainland under Persian control. The first expedition, launched in 490 BCE, was led by the Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes. Their fleet sailed across the Aegean, stopping first at the island of Naxos, which they captured and burned in retribution. Next, they moved against Eretria, which fell after a brief siege. The city was plundered, and its population was deported, just as the people of Miletus had been. From there, the Persian force sailed to the Bay of Marathon, northeast of Athens. There they landed and prepared to advance on the city. The Athenians, though outnumbered, chose to confront the invaders on the plain rather than wait behind their city walls. They were led by the general Miltiades, a seasoned strategist who had previously served under Persian rule in the Chersonese. The Battle of Marathon became one of the most celebrated engagements in ancient history. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Athenians launched a daring frontal assault. The center of their line initially buckled under Persian pressure, but the flanks held strong and enveloped the enemy. The result was a stunning Greek victory. thousands of Persian soldiers were killed or captured, while the Athenians suffered comparatively light losses. The psychological impact of Marathon was enormous. For the Greeks, it proved that the Persians, despite their vast empire and feared military, could be defeated in open battle. For the Persians, it was a temporary setback, but one that called for serious reassessment. Darius, though still powerful, now faced a determined and capable enemy on the western edge of his empire. In the years following the defeat at Marathon, Darius began preparing for a larger and more decisive campaign. He intended to invade Greece with an even greater force, aiming not only to punish Athens, but to bring the entire region under Persian control. However, his plans were interrupted by unrest in Egypt, which had risen in revolt against Persian rule. Before he could resolve the Egyptian crisis or renew the campaign in Greece, Darius died in 586 BCE. The task of continuing his imperial ambitions fell to his son and successor, Xerxes. The death of Darius the Great in the year 586 BCE marked a significant turning point in the history of the Persian Empire. His son, Xerxes, ascended to the throne at a time when the empire stood unrivaled in its size and wealth, yet its western frontier had been shaken by Greek defiance. Xerxes inherited not only his father's vast dominion, but also his ambition to subdue the Greeks once and for all. Xerxes was the son of Darius and Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great. This made him the heir not only to an imperial legacy, but to the memory of Persia's founding generation. Early in his reign, however, he was faced with internal matters that delayed his military plans. Egypt had revolted against Persian rule, and Xerxes was forced to put down the uprising before turning his attention westward. Once Egypt was pacified and order restored, Xerxes began preparations for a massive campaign against Greece. Unlike the limited expedition of his father, Xerxes envisioned a grand invasion, one that would not only punish Athens and its allies, but bring the entire Greek mainland under Persian control. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Herodotus, the main source for the Greco-Persian Wars, describes the scale in great detail. According to his account, Xerxes spent several years preparing for the invasion. He ordered the construction of supply depots, the recruitment of soldiers from across the empire, and most famously, the construction of a canal through the Athos Peninsula to allow ships safe passage. This canal, dug by forced labor from various subject peoples, was a logistical marvel and a display of Persian ambition. Perhaps most symbolically, Xerxes ordered the construction of two massive pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. When the first bridges were destroyed by a storm, Xerxes, in a display of imperial wrath, reportedly ordered the sea itself to be whipped with chains and cursed. Though dramatic, the episode reflects the central theme of Persian kingship: the conquest of nature in service of imperial order. By the spring of 480 BCE, the army and navy were assembled. The Persian land force, drawn from dozens of ethnic groups across the empire, was immense. Though exact numbers are debated, Herodotus claims hundreds of thousands of infantry and cavalry, supported by a fleet of over 1,000 ships. Even if these figures are exaggerated, the invasion force was certainly among the largest the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes led the army in person, crossing the Hellespont and beginning the long march through Thrace and Macedonia into Greece. Many Greek states, fearing the power of Persia, chose to submit. Others, including Athens and Sparta, resolved to resist. The first major encounter came at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. There, a small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas attempted to delay the Persian advance. The Greeks chose their position well. The pass was narrow enough to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. For 2 days, the Greeks held their ground. The Spartans, renowned for their discipline and training, fought fiercely alongside contingents from Thespiae, Thebes, and other cities. However, a local resident named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks by revealing a mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank their position. Realizing they had been surrounded, Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek forces and remained with a small rear guard. including his famed 300 Spartans. They fought to the death, delaying the Persians long enough for the Greek allies to regroup further south. Though a tactical defeat, Thermopylae became a symbol of courage and sacrifice. It demonstrated that Persian power could be resisted and that Greek unity, however fragile, was possible in the face of external threat. Following Thermopylae, the Persians advanced rapidly. They entered Boeotia and captured Athens, which had been evacuated by its population. Xerxes ordered the burning of the Acropolis, a symbolic act meant to show the futility of resistance. Yet the Greek fleet, led by the Athenian general Themistocles, remained intact and prepared for battle in the narrow straits of Salamis. Themistocles devised a strategy that took advantage of the narrow waterways. He sent a deceptive message to Xerxes, claiming that the Greeks planned to retreat. Xerxes, eager to crush the remaining resistance, ordered his fleet into the straits. The crowded conditions favored the smaller, more maneuverable Greek triremes. In the ensuing Battle of Salamis, the Persian navy suffered a disastrous defeat. Greek ships rammed and disabled the larger Persian vessels, while confusion spread among the imperial ranks. Xerxes, watching from a nearby hillside, witnessed the destruction of a significant portion of his fleet. The loss at Salamis marked a turning point. Though the Persian army remained formidable, the defeat at sea made further operations in southern Greece difficult. Xerxes decided to withdraw the bulk of his forces and return to Asia, leaving a general named Mardonius in command of a smaller force to continue the campaign. The following year, in 479 BCE, a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens, Sparta, and Corinth, assembled a large land force and confronted the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. The Persians were defeated decisively. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek navy won another victory at Mycale in Asia Minor, further weakening Persian control in the Aegean. These defeats ended the Persian invasion of Greece. While the empire remained vast and powerful, it had failed to subdue the fiercely independent Greek poleis. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean was beginning to shift. In the years that followed, Persia continued to exert influence over Greek affairs, often through diplomacy and financial support for rival city-states. However, the myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered. The wars had demonstrated the limits of imperial power, especially in regions where geography, local identity, and political structure favored resistance. For the Greeks, the victories became foundational myths, reinforcing their belief in freedom, civic virtue, and military courage. For the Persians, the wars were a costly venture that revealed the challenges of overreach and the unpredictability of distant campaigns. Xerxes would spend the remainder of his reign managing affairs within the empire. He continued building projects at Persepolis and Susa, maintaining the grandeur of the royal court. But his ambitions of conquering Greece had been thwarted. His assassination in the mid-5th century BCE brought an end to his reign, and his successors would take a more cautious approach to foreign policy in the West. The defeat of Xerxes' invasion marked a critical transition in the history of the Achaemenid Empire. While the Persian military had suffered losses in Greece, the empire itself remained vast, wealthy, and intact. Its core territories were secure, and its administrative system continued to function. Yet, the costly campaigns and changing dynamics in the Aegean world forced a shift in imperial strategy, one that focused more on stability, diplomacy, and selective intervention rather than direct conquest. After Xerxes returned from Greece, his attention turned inward. He resumed construction projects, particularly at Persepolis and Susa, seeking to reinforce royal authority and celebrate Persian grandeur. These architectural efforts included audience halls, palace complexes, and elaborate reliefs that depicted the diverse peoples of the empire bringing tribute to the king. The message was clear. Despite setbacks, the Persian Empire was still the center of power and civilization. However, the western frontier had become more volatile. The Greek city-states, emboldened by their victories at Salamis and Plataea, began to assert greater independence and expand their influence. Athens in particular emerged as a naval power and took the lead in organizing a new alliance known as the Delian League. Originally formed to defend against future Persian aggression, the League gradually transformed into an Athenian empire in all but name. The Persian response to these developments was cautious but deliberate. Rather than launching another large-scale invasion, the Persian kings, beginning with Xerxes' successor, Artaxerxes I, turned to diplomacy, economic influence, and proxy conflict to maintain Persian interests in the region. Artaxerxes I, who came to the throne after Xerxes' assassination, ruled for over 40 years. His reign was marked by efforts to manage relations with the Greek world while preserving internal stability. One of his most notable decisions was to support rival Greek factions in order to divide and weaken their alliances. This strategy, known today as a classic divide and rule approach, proved effective. During the mid-5th century BCE, Athens found itself in conflict with several Greek states, including Sparta. Persia, observing these rivalries, provided support to whichever side best served its interests at the moment. For example, Persia backed Sparta during certain phases of the Peloponnesian War, helping to undermine Athenian dominance without committing Persian troops to direct confrontation. At the same time, Persia reinforced its hold on Asia Minor, the region most affected by the Ionian Revolt decades earlier. Persian satraps in Lydia and Phrygia maintained close control over the coastal cities, balancing suppression with cooperation. Local elites were often allowed to govern their cities under Persian oversight, as long as they remained loyal and paid tribute. One of the most prominent Persian officials in the West during this period was Tissaphernes, satrap of Lydia and Caria. He played a key role in managing relations with the Greeks and negotiating with both Athens and Sparta. His efforts reflected a broader Persian strategy: avoid overextension while using wealth and diplomacy to maintain influence. Meanwhile, internal strains began to surface within the empire. The satrapal system, while effective at administering distant provinces, also gave regional governors considerable autonomy. In some cases, satraps began to act as semi-independent rulers, collecting taxes and raising armies for their own purposes. Though still nominally loyal to the king, their growing power posed a long-term challenge to central authority. These tensions were evident in regions such as Egypt, which experienced several revolts against Persian rule during the 5th century BCE. While some of these uprisings were suppressed with relative ease, others required more significant military efforts. In certain cases, the rebels received support from Athens, adding a layer of geopolitical complexity. Despite these challenges, the Achaemenid administrative system remained resilient. The empire's ability to collect tribute, maintain trade routes, and deploy military force when necessary allowed it to endure. Persian roads continued to facilitate communication and commerce across the empire, while the royal court served as a hub of political and cultural life. Persian influence extended beyond military and political realms. Throughout the 5th century BCE, Persian ideas, art, and customs flowed into the Mediterranean world. Greek artists and architects borrowed elements from Persian design, while Persian luxury goods, such as textiles, spices, and precious metals, became coveted in Greek markets. Yet, for all its accomplishments, the empire was becoming increasingly reactive rather than proactive in its foreign policy. The memory of defeat in Greece lingered, and subsequent kings appeared reluctant to risk large-scale engagements in the West. Instead, they focused on preserving what had already been gained and avoiding further humiliation. The reign of Artaxerxes I was followed by a series of shorter reigns and internal struggles for succession. These transitions, while not entirely destabilizing, contributed to a gradual erosion of centralized power. Satraps became more assertive, court factions grew more influential, and royal authority became harder to enforce across all corners of the empire. Still, the core principles of Persian governance endured. The empire's tolerance of cultural and religious diversity continued to foster loyalty among many of its subjects. Zoroastrianism remained the dominant religious ideology at court, but local traditions, from Mesopotamian temple worship to Egyptian priesthoods, were respected and often supported financially. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was still the most powerful political entity in the known world. It had survived wars with Greece, internal revolts, and shifting alliances. But the geopolitical landscape had changed. The rise of Athens, the growing strength of Sparta, and the fragmentation of Greek politics created new opportunities and threats. The Persian court remained engaged, but it no longer dictated terms with the same confidence that had marked the reign of Darius or the early years of Xerxes. The empire's western frontier had become a zone of negotiation, compromise, and occasional conflict, managed not through overwhelming force, but through strategic patience. While military campaigns and political rivalries often dominate historical narratives, the enduring legacy of the Achaemenid Empire is as much cultural and administrative as it is military. During the long period of relative stability that followed the Persian Wars, the empire reached the height of its artistic, architectural, and bureaucratic development. This was a period during which imperial identity was expressed not through expansion, but through refinement, through monuments, language, and the efficient organization of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. At the center of this cultural flowering stood Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire. Founded by Darius the Great and expanded by his successors, Persepolis was not a city in the traditional sense. It was never intended to house large populations or serve as an administrative center. Instead, it was a symbolic space, a place where the king received delegations, held ceremonies, and displayed the empire's grandeur. Constructed on a massive stone terrace at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, Persepolis was a masterpiece of design and symbolism. Its great audience halls, known as apadanas, were supported by towering columns decorated with capitals in the shape of bulls, lions, and other animals. The reliefs carved into the staircases and walls depicted a unified empire, processions of dignitaries from distant lands bringing tribute to the king. These images included representatives from India, Babylon, Egypt, Lydia, and beyond, each shown in distinctive local dress, bearing gifts specific to their region. The message was clear. The Achaemenid Empire was a vast but harmonious order, governed by a benevolent monarch and united through diversity. The king stood not above his subjects in isolation, but at the center of a web of loyalties, customs, and exchanges. Susa, another royal center, functioned more directly as an administrative capital. It was from here that many royal decrees were issued and where royal archives were maintained. The city's architecture combined Persian, Mesopotamian, and Elamite elements, further emphasizing the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. Art and architecture under the Achaemenids were both symbolic and practical. Stone reliefs, glazed bricks, and gold-inlaid inscriptions celebrated the power of the king while reinforcing the idea of divine legitimacy. Royal tombs, such as those at Nakshi Rustam near Persepolis, were carved directly into cliffs and featured inscriptions extolling the greatness of the king, his victories, and his right to rule. These inscriptions were typically written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, 3 of the empire's major written languages. This multilingual policy reflects the inclusiveness of Achaemenid governance. Rather than impose a single language or script, the Persians embraced linguistic diversity and used it to enhance communication and legitimacy. One of the most famous inscriptions from this period is the Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in western Iran by Darius the Great. It records his rise to power, his suppression of revolts, and his divine support from Ahura Mazda. Importantly, it served as a declaration of lawful authority and was meant to be seen and read by travelers and officials moving across the empire. The religious worldview that underpinned much of Achaemenid ideology was rooted in Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith that emphasized the struggle between truth, Asha, and falsehood, Druj, good and evil. While not formally institutionalized as a state religion, Zoroastrian beliefs clearly shaped the language of kingship and ethics. The king, chosen by Ahura Mazda, was responsible for maintaining order and justice throughout the empire. Religious tolerance was a hallmark of Achaemenid policy. Rather than attempting to convert conquered peoples, the Persian kings often funded local temples, respected traditional priesthoods, and allowed subject populations to worship according to their own customs. This approach helped foster loyalty and reduce resistance. In Babylon, Persian kings supported the powerful Marduk priesthood. In Egypt, they presented themselves as successors to the pharaohs and restored temples neglected under previous regimes. One of the most famous examples of Persian tolerance is recorded in the so-called Cyrus cylinder, an inscription from the reign of Cyrus the Great found in Babylon. It declares Cyrus's commitment to restoring displaced peoples and their religious sanctuaries. Though not a charter of human rights in the modern sense, it reflects the Persian principle of ruling through respect and restoration rather than destruction. This principle extended to law and administration. While the empire maintained a centralized authority under the king, local laws and customs were often preserved. Satraps, the provincial governors, were expected to collect taxes and maintain order, but they usually allowed local councils and courts to function according to tradition. This dual structure enabled the empire to govern diverse populations without constant repression. Economically, the empire benefited from a network of trade routes that spanned from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. The Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis, was patrolled and maintained to facilitate communication, trade, and the movement of troops. Caravans carried goods such as textiles, spices, metals, and ceramics across great distances. The introduction of standardized coinage, particularly the gold daric, further integrated regional economies. The empire's scale required a sophisticated system of record-keeping and logistics. Clay tablets from Persepolis, written in Elamite, reveal details of labor assignments, rations, and supply chains. These records show that the Achaemenid administration was not only vast but methodical, capable of tracking resources, managing personnel, and coordinating large projects across distant territories. This emphasis on structure and order extended to court ceremony as well. The Persian king was a semi-divine figure, rarely seen by ordinary subjects. Access to the royal presence was strictly controlled, and elaborate protocols governed how officials approached and addressed the king. These rituals reinforced the majesty and authority of the monarch while maintaining the appearance of cosmic order. Yet, for all its grandeur, the Achaemenid court also fostered a level of cultural exchange that was rare for its time. Greek physicians, artisans from Phoenicia, architects from Lydia, and scribes from Babylonia all served in various capacities. The empire functioned not as a monoculture, but as a dynamic system that integrated and elevated the contributions of many civilizations. Persian culture also found its way outward. In Anatolia, artistic motifs and administrative practices reflected Persian influence. In Egypt, Persian inscriptions accompanied traditional hieroglyphs. Even in Greece, where resistance to Persian power had been fierce, elements of Persian art, fashion, and organization became fashionable among elites. By the early 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire represented one of the most successful multicultural states in ancient history. It had managed to combine military strength with administrative innovation, religious tolerance, and artistic expression. Its legacy would shape not only the lands it ruled, but also the empires that followed. But the stability that enabled this cultural peak was not immune to the challenges of time. Behind the ceremonial splendor of Persepolis and the efficient bureaucracy of Susa, pressures were building: economic strains, ambitious satraps, and rival claims to the throne. By the early 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire still stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the valleys of the Indus. Its systems of governance remained intact, and its kings continued to rule from the palaces of Susa and Persepolis. But beneath the surface, the empire was weakening. Internal divisions, rising satrapal autonomy, court intrigues, and economic strains had begun to erode the firm foundation laid by Darius the Great and his successors. This period of slow decline might have stretched on for generations, were it not for the emergence of an extraordinary figure to the west, Alexander, the son of Philip II of Macedon. Philip II had unified the Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony, and laid the groundwork for a campaign against Persia. But his assassination passed that ambition to his 20-year-old son. Young though he was, Alexander inherited not only his father's military machine, but also his vision of expansion. With a disciplined army, political support from the Greek League, and personal ambition that knew no limits, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in the spring of the year 334 BCE. The Persian king at the time was Darius III, a ruler who had come to the throne after a period of internal strife and assassination. His authority was not deeply rooted, and many satraps acted with significant independence. Although Darius commanded the resources of a vast empire, he would struggle to unify it against the fast-moving, tactically brilliant Macedonian king. Alexander's first major confrontation with Persian forces occurred at the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persian army, commanded by local satraps, attempted to block Alexander's advance in Asia Minor. Despite their superior numbers, the Persian cavalry failed to dislodge Alexander's forces, and the Macedonians secured a clear victory. This battle opened the way for Alexander to move through western Anatolia, where he captured key cities and gained support from local Greek communities who resented Persian oversight. Following this, Alexander marched south, securing coastal cities and neutralizing the Persian navy's bases. One of the most dramatic episodes of the campaign was the Siege of Tyre. The island city resisted Alexander's forces for months, but he eventually constructed a causeway to reach its walls and stormed the city. Though costly, the siege eliminated a major Persian naval stronghold and demonstrated the lengths to which Alexander would go to subdue resistance. In the year 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III directly at the Battle of Issus in what is now southern Turkey. Darius had assembled a massive army and expected a decisive victory. However, Alexander's tactical skill and personal leadership turned the tide. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, and Alexander led a direct charge at Darius's position. In the chaos, Darius fled the battlefield, leaving behind his family and royal treasures. The psychological effect of Issus was significant. Although Darius escaped, the aura of Persian invincibility was shattered. Many Persian subjects began to doubt their king's ability to protect them, while Alexander's reputation grew enormously. Following Issus, Alexander continued south into Egypt. There, he was welcomed as a liberator, and he took the opportunity to consolidate his power. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest urban centers of the ancient world. In Egypt, Alexander also visited the oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, where he may have been declared the son of a god, a claim that reinforced his growing sense of divine destiny. Meanwhile, Darius attempted to regroup. He sent envoys to Alexander offering peace terms, including the cession of western territories and a vast ransom. Alexander rejected the offer, insisting that he alone was the rightful king of Asia. Determined to finish what he had started, he marched into the heart of the Persian Empire. The final confrontation came in the year 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela, near present-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius had gathered a massive army drawn from all corners of the empire, including infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and scythed chariots. The battlefield was specially prepared to favor Persian chariots and cavalry movements. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander executed a brilliant tactical plan. He drew the Persian forces outward with feigned retreats and exploited the resulting gaps with precision attacks. Once again, Darius fled the battlefield, and once again, the Persian army dissolved in confusion. With the road to Mesopotamia open, Alexander entered Babylon, where he was greeted as a king. From there, he moved to Susa and finally Persepolis, the symbolic heart of the Achaemenid Empire. The city, with its palaces, treasure rooms, and ceremonial halls, represented the culmination of Persian imperial achievement. Yet, in a symbolic act of conquest, Alexander allowed his troops to loot Persepolis and, according to ancient sources, permitted the burning of its grand palace. Some accounts claim the fire began accidentally. Others say it was intentional, perhaps a gesture of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens over a century earlier. The burning of Persepolis marked the symbolic end of the Achaemenid dynasty, though Darius III was still alive. He had fled eastward, seeking to raise a new army. However, his power was broken, and his own satraps began to abandon him. In a final act of betrayal, Darius was captured and murdered by one of his own commanders, Bessus, satrap of Bactria. Alexander, upon discovering Darius's body, expressed anger at the murder and gave the fallen king a royal funeral. He then pursued Bessus into Central Asia, seeking to punish him and consolidate his control over the remaining eastern provinces. In time, Bessus was captured and executed. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire did not mark the end of Persian culture or influence. In many ways, Alexander adopted the legacy of the empire he had conquered. He kept much of its administrative structure, wore Persian clothing, married into Persian nobility, and even appointed Persian satraps and officials. His aim was not to destroy Persia, but to rule it as its new king, blending Macedonian and Persian traditions in what he saw as a unified empire. Yet the loss of the Achaemenid dynasty was profound. It marked the end of a 2-century-old imperial system that had ruled with a mixture of tolerance, administrative efficiency, and cultural sophistication. The empire that had begun with Cyrus the Great, expanded under Darius, and reached its artistic height in Persepolis, had fallen to a single ambitious conqueror. With the death of Darius III and the conquest of Persia by Alexander of Macedon, the Achaemenid Empire had come to an end. Yet, although its imperial structure had collapsed, the Persian world did not vanish. Instead, it entered a new and complex phase under foreign rule, beginning with the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic state that attempted to fuse Greek and Persian traditions while navigating the tensions between them. Following Alexander's untimely death in the city of Babylon in the year 323 BCE, his empire fractured almost immediately. He had left no clear successor capable of holding together the vast territories stretching from Greece to India. His generals, known as the Diadochi, competed for control, carving the empire into rival kingdoms. After years of conflict, a former cavalry commander named Seleucus emerged as ruler over the eastern provinces, including most of the former Persian heartlands. Seleucus established the Seleucid Empire, which at its height extended from western Anatolia to the borders of India. Though Macedonian in origin, Seleucus recognized the need to govern a region steeped in centuries of Persian tradition. His rule marked the beginning of a Hellenistic phase in Iranian history, a period during which Greek and Persian cultures coexisted, clashed, and occasionally fused. One of Seleucus's first challenges was legitimizing his authority in a land that had been ruled for centuries by native dynasties. Rather than attempt to replace local customs outright, the Seleucids adopted many elements of Persian governance. They maintained the satrapal system of provincial administration and allowed many Persian elites to retain their positions, provided they pledged loyalty to the new regime. Temples continued to receive patronage, and local religions were largely tolerated. However, the Seleucids also promoted Greek language, art, and urban planning. They founded numerous cities, often naming them after themselves or members of Alexander's entourage: Antioch, Seleucia, Apamea. These cities were built with grid patterns, agora, marketplaces, gymnasiums, and theaters, serving as administrative centers and cultural hubs for the Hellenistic elite. Greek settlers were encouraged to move into these cities, and over time, a Greek-speaking urban class emerged in parts of Iran. The most prominent of these cities was Seleucia on the Tigris, founded near the ruins of Babylon. It became the new capital of the eastern Seleucid world and rivaled other great cities in trade, population, and influence. The city reflected the ambitions of the Seleucid kings to create a state that balanced Greek rationalism with the grandeur of the Persian past. Despite these efforts at integration, the Seleucid Empire faced persistent challenges in governing the eastern territories. The empire was vast, and the further one moved from the Mediterranean core, the more tenuous Seleucid authority became. In the Iranian plateau and Central Asia, satraps and local dynasts exercised significant autonomy. These regions retained deep-rooted Persian traditions that resisted full Hellenization. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian faith, continued to flourish despite the prominence of Greek religion among the ruling elite. fire temples remained active, and Zoroastrian priests maintained their role in rural and tribal communities. While the Seleucid kings often supported local cults for political reasons, they never embraced Zoroastrianism as an imperial religion, creating a cultural gap between rulers and many of their subjects. Additionally, the Seleucid military depended heavily on Greek and Macedonian troops, many of whom were unfamiliar with the terrain and customs of Iran. The distance from the imperial center in Syria to the eastern provinces made communication and response to revolts slow and difficult. This situation created opportunities for local powers to reassert themselves. One such challenge came from the Iranian steppe to the northeast. A tribe known as the Parni, part of the larger Dahai Confederation, began to exert pressure on the Seleucid eastern frontiers. These nomadic horsemen, skilled in archery and cavalry tactics, would soon give rise to a new Iranian power, the Parthians. Their emergence marked the beginning of the end for Seleucid control over Persia. In addition to military threats, the Seleucid Empire was plagued by dynastic disputes and succession crises. The descendants of Seleucus often fought among themselves for control of the throne, leading to internal instability. These rivalries weakened central authority and made the provinces more difficult to govern. Moreover, the Seleucids were constantly entangled in wars with other Hellenistic kingdoms, such as the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Antigonids in Macedon. These conflicts diverted resources and attention away from the eastern territories, where unrest simmered. Despite these pressures, the Seleucid period left a lasting cultural impact. Hellenistic art, philosophy, and science found their way into Persian cities. At the same time, Persian motifs and religious ideas influenced Greek settlers. In some areas, coinage featured both Greek and local symbols. Bilingual inscriptions became more common, and artistic styles blended classical and Eastern elements. One notable example of this fusion is found in the development of Greco-Buddhism in regions such as Bactria and Gandhara, where Greek artistic techniques were applied to Indian religious imagery. Although geographically on the empire's edge, these regions highlight the complex cultural interactions sparked by Seleucid rule. By the mid-3rd century BCE, however, the empire's weaknesses had become more apparent. Local revolts grew more frequent, and the central government was increasingly unable to project its power. The rise of Rome in the west and renewed threats from nomadic peoples in the east placed further strain on the empire's resources. In the eastern Iranian world, a decisive blow came when Xerxes, leader of the Parni tribe, seized control of Parthia, a former satrapy in northeastern Iran. Around the year 247 BCE, Xerxes declared independence from the Seleucid Empire and established the Arsacid dynasty, which would eventually form the Parthian Empire. Although initially limited in scope, this rebellion marked the beginning of a new Iranian resurgence. The Seleucids attempted to retake the lost territory, but their efforts were inconsistent and ultimately unsuccessful. Over the next several decades, Parthia expanded, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness and gaining support from local populations who saw the Arsacids as a return to native rule. By the time the 2nd century BCE began, Seleucid control over Iran was collapsing. The empire that had tried to combine the legacies of Greece and Persia was retreating westward, while a new power rooted in Iranian tradition was on the rise. As the Seleucid Empire weakened under the weight of internal strife and external pressures, the Iranian plateau witnessed the reawakening of native power. From the northeast frontier, a new dynasty arose, one that would restore Persian sovereignty, challenge imperial norms, and carve out an enduring place in Iranian history. This was the rise of the Parthians, also known as the Arsacid dynasty, named after their founding leader, Xerxes. The Parthians were originally part of the Dahai, a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived along the northeastern edge of the Iranian world, near the steppes of Central Asia. Among these tribes, the Parni stood out for their military prowess and organizational discipline. Skilled in mounted archery and steppe warfare, they blended nomadic traditions with the political ambitions of a settled empire. The turning point came in the mid-3rd century BCE, when Arsaces, a chieftain of the Parni, led his people into the region of Parthia, a satrapy of the Seleucid Empire located in northeastern Iran. Around the year 247 BCE, he seized control of this region, capitalizing on Seleucid instability and local dissatisfaction. He established a base at Nisa, a city that would serve as one of the early capitals of the new Parthian state. Though modest at first, the Arsacid revolt represented more than just a provincial rebellion. It symbolized the reassertion of Iranian identity after decades of foreign rule. The Parthians quickly adopted many aspects of Persian kingship, including the use of Zoroastrian symbolism and the Old Persian title, King of Kings. Yet, they did so in a way that reflected their unique origins and geopolitical realities. Arsaces was succeeded by his brother, Tiridates, and over the following generations, the Arsacids consolidated their rule over Parthia and expanded westward. Their legitimacy was strengthened by local support and the steady retreat of Seleucid influence from the Iranian plateau. The Seleucid kings, preoccupied with conflicts in the west and civil wars within their own ranks, failed to mount an effective reconquest. The true architect of Parthian power, however, was Mithridates I, who came to the throne in the early 2nd century BCE. Under his rule, the Parthians transformed from a regional force into a true empire. Mithridates launched a series of campaigns that extended Parthian control into Media, Babylonia, and Elam. His victories brought the heartland of Persia back under Iranian rule for the first time since the fall of the Achaemenids. One of Mithridates' key strategies was to incorporate diverse peoples into his administration. While he emphasized Iranian traditions, he also adopted elements of Hellenistic governance where useful. Greek remained a language of administration and diplomacy, especially in former Seleucid cities. Yet Mithridates increasingly emphasized Iranian culture, language, and Zoroastrian values in his royal image. Coinage from his reign shows this duality clearly. Early Parthian coins bore Greek inscriptions and portrayed the king in Hellenistic style. Later issues shifted toward more distinctly Iranian iconography, reflecting the growing confidence of the new regime. As the Parthians expanded, they encountered both opportunity and resistance. In Mesopotamia, they faced remnants of Seleucid authority as well as independent city-states. In the West, they came into contact with the emerging power of Rome, which was expanding eastward after its victories in the Mediterranean. The collision between these two powers would shape much of Parthian foreign policy for centuries. The Parthian military system was built around its cavalry. Unlike the heavy infantry formations of the Greeks or the legions of Rome, Parthian armies relied on mobility, endurance, and precision. The most feared unit was the cataphract, heavily armored horsemen who could deliver devastating charges. Supporting them were mounted archers, whose hit-and-run tactics made Parthian armies difficult to engage in traditional battle. This unique approach to warfare was showcased in one of the most famous confrontations of the era, the Battle of Carrhae. In the year 53 BCE, a Roman army under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus invaded Parthian territory, seeking military glory and eastern riches. The Parthians, led by the general Surena, lured the Romans into the desert and decimated them using superior tactics and cavalry maneuvers. The defeat was humiliating for Rome. Crassus was killed, and thousands of Roman soldiers were either slain or taken captive. The victory at Carrhae established Parthia as a formidable power in the eastern Mediterranean and served as a warning to Rome that the East could not be conquered with ease. Politically, the Parthian Empire developed a distinctive model of rule. Unlike the centralized bureaucracies of the Achaemenids or the Seleucids, the Arsacids maintained a loose confederation of semi-autonomous kingdoms and noble families. Local dynasts, particularly in regions such as Armenia and Elymais, were allowed considerable independence as long as they acknowledged Parthian supremacy and contributed military support. This feudal structure gave the empire flexibility, but also made it vulnerable to internal divisions. Succession disputes were common, and rival claimants often relied on powerful noble families to back their bids for the throne. The Arsacid kings had to constantly negotiate, reward loyalty, and assert their authority in a political landscape where allegiance was always subject to change. Culturally, the Parthians cultivated a revival of Iranian traditions. They patronized Zoroastrian temples and supported the priestly class, though the religion remained diverse and decentralized. Fire temples reappeared across the Iranian plateau, and sacred texts were preserved orally and in writing. At the same time, the Parthians absorbed influences from their diverse subjects, resulting in a rich, hybrid cultural world that included Hellenistic, Babylonian, Armenian, and even Indian elements. The Parthians also developed a royal ideology that emphasized continuity with the past. They presented themselves as heirs to both the Achaemenids and the spiritual traditions of ancient Iran. Royal titles emphasized legitimacy, divine favor, and the protection of order, Asha, against chaos, Darius, core principles of Zoroastrian belief. Over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Parthian Empire became one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. Its rivalry with Rome defined the politics of the Near East, while its internal stability allowed for flourishing trade along the Silk Road. Goods from China, India, and Central Asia passed through Parthian territory en route to the Mediterranean, bringing wealth and fostering cultural exchange. Despite their decentralized system, the Parthians maintained control over their vast realm for nearly 5 centuries. They succeeded where the Seleucids had failed, by forging a durable Iranian state that combined native traditions with the demands of imperial governance. However, their model also had limits. The same noble families that made the empire flexible could also challenge royal authority. The lack of a standardized bureaucracy made central control difficult. And as new challenges emerged, both from within and beyond the borders, the Parthians would eventually face the need for reform and renewal. As the Parthian Empire expanded across the Iranian plateau and into Mesopotamia, it came face to face with a rising power from the west, Rome. What followed was a centuries-long rivalry between two of the ancient world's greatest empires, a geopolitical struggle defined by war, diplomacy, and cultural interaction. This confrontation not only shaped the fate of the Near East, but also tested the resilience and adaptability of the Parthian state. Rome's emergence as a regional superpower had accelerated following its conquests in the Western Mediterranean, particularly after the defeat of Carthage in the Punic Wars. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman interests had moved eastward, bringing the Republic, and later the Empire, into direct contact with Hellenistic and Eastern kingdoms. The absorption of territories once ruled by the Seleucids brought Rome closer to the Euphrates River, the traditional frontier of Mesopotamia, and, by extension, Parthian territory. The first major clash occurred in the mid-1st century BCE. In an effort to secure Rome's eastern border and gain personal military glory, Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of the powerful First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, launched an invasion of Parthian lands. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Carrhae, where Crassus was killed and his army nearly annihilated by the Parthian general Surena. Parthian tactics, centered on highly mobile cavalry and mounted archers, proved devastating against the slower Roman legions. This victory had both immediate and long-term consequences. It was a humiliating blow to Roman prestige and established Parthia as a serious rival. It also introduced the Roman world to the effectiveness of Eastern cavalry warfare, influencing military strategies in future encounters. Following Carrhae, Rome and Parthia entered a prolonged period of alternating hostility and negotiation. Neither side was able to decisively conquer the other's core territories, but both sought to assert dominance over the buffer zones that lay between them, particularly Armenia. This mountainous kingdom, located between the Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, became a focal point of diplomatic and military maneuvering. The Armenians themselves were often caught in the middle, sometimes favoring Rome, at other times allying with Parthia. Both empires attempted to install friendly kings on the Armenian throne, and the kingdom frequently changed hands as the balance of power shifted. These proxy struggles reflected the broader pattern of Roman-Parthian rivalry. Direct conflict was costly and inconclusive, but influence could be gained through client kings and shifting alliances. One of the most dramatic episodes of this ongoing contest occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Following a period of civil war in Rome and the fall of the Republic, Augustus established the Principate and sought to stabilize the empire's borders. In the east, this included negotiating a settlement with Parthia. Rather than engaging in another full-scale war, Augustus used diplomacy. He secured the return of the Roman standards lost at Carrhae, symbols of honor and military pride, through negotiation rather than battle. The agreement, while limited in scope, allowed both sides to claim success and averted further bloodshed for a time. Still, tensions remained. The 1st century CE saw periodic flare-ups, including Roman campaigns into Armenia and Parthian incursions into Roman Syria. The Parthians maintained their traditional military style, relying on swift cavalry and decentralized command, while the Romans relied on heavily fortified frontier cities and disciplined infantry formations. The geographical nature of the Near East, with its deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges, often favored the defensive over the offensive, preventing either side from achieving lasting conquests. Despite these military stalemates, the interactions between Rome and Parthia went beyond warfare. Trade between the two empires flourished, particularly along the Silk Road. Parthia served as a key intermediary between Rome and the civilizations of Central Asia, India, and China. Luxury goods such as silk, spices, pearls, and fine textiles passed through Parthian hands en route to Roman markets, while Roman glassware, silver, and artwork made their way eastward. This trade was not just economic, it also fostered cultural exchange. Roman coins, inscriptions, and goods have been found deep in Parthian territory. At the same time, Eastern motifs began appearing in Roman art and architecture. The Parthian dress and style, including trousers and soft boots, even influenced Roman fashion in the eastern provinces. Meanwhile, the Parthian court cultivated its own identity, distinct from both Achaemenid and Hellenistic models. The Arsacid kings emphasized their Iranian heritage while also adopting certain Hellenistic practices where useful. They issued coins bearing their portraits, often with inscriptions in Greek, but depicted themselves in traditional Parthian garb, with tiaras and long beards. Their rule blended tribal leadership with royal ceremony, and they continued to rely on the support of powerful noble families who held substantial local authority. One of the recurring challenges for the Parthians was maintaining cohesion within this loosely structured empire. While their flexible approach allowed for local autonomy and cultural diversity, it also made it difficult to coordinate large-scale reforms or centralized administration. Rebellions among satraps, disputes over succession, and rivalries between noble clans frequently destabilized the court. Despite these issues, the Parthians endured. They remained a powerful counterweight to Rome in the east and preserved an Iranian imperial tradition that had survived Alexander's conquests and the Seleucid interlude. The Arsacids styled themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius, and their survival against one of history's most powerful empires reinforced their legitimacy. The rivalry between Parthia and Rome continued into the 2nd century CE. Under the Roman emperors Trajan and Hadrian, the balance briefly shifted. Trajan launched a full-scale invasion of Parthian territory and even captured the cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon. He declared Mesopotamia a Roman province, but his gains were short-lived. After his death, Hadrian reversed the expansion and withdrew Roman forces, recognizing the difficulty of holding territory so far from the imperial center. The back-and-forth nature of Roman-Parthian relations persisted for another century. Each side claimed victories and suffered setbacks, but neither was able to deliver a decisive blow. This equilibrium eventually gave way to new tensions, not just between Rome and Parthia, but within Parthia itself. By the late 2nd century CE, the Arsacid dynasty was in decline. Internal divisions grew more severe, and central authority weakened. Noble families acted increasingly independently, and conflicts over succession became more frequent and disruptive. This disintegration opened the door to new challenges from both Rome and internal reformers. By the close of the 2nd century CE, the Parthian Empire, once a formidable rival to Rome and a proud heir to Persian sovereignty, was showing deep signs of strain. While its military had held off Roman incursions and its economy continued to benefit from Silk Road trade, internal instability was eroding the empire's foundations. The same decentralized model that had once allowed the Arsacid dynasty to govern a vast and culturally diverse territory now left it vulnerable to fragmentation. At the core of this vulnerability was the structure of Parthian rule itself. The Arsacid monarchs operated a confederation of semi-autonomous noble houses. These aristocratic families, while loyal in name to the central king, often exercised independent control over their own regions, commanding local armies, collecting taxes, and administering justice. The king had to constantly negotiate with these families to maintain power, often by granting privileges or making strategic marriages. This balance worked for generations, especially during times of external threat when unity was essential. However, in periods of peace or weak leadership, the centrifugal forces of the nobility grew stronger. Succession disputes became increasingly common as rival branches of the Arsacid family and their noble backers vied for control of the throne. By the early 3rd century CE, the situation had deteriorated into a series of open conflicts. Different claimants to the throne emerged across the empire, each backed by powerful regional elites. This period of civil strife severely weakened the ability of the central government to function effectively. As resources were diverted toward internal battles, the administration of provinces faltered, trade was disrupted, and the military became divided in its loyalties. The weakening of the Arsacid court also led to religious uncertainty. Zoroastrianism remained a widespread and deeply rooted faith, but it lacked a centralized structure. Fire temples varied in practice, and no single priestly authority unified doctrine or ritual. In this environment, alternative religious movements gained ground. Among these was the dualist religion of Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani, which synthesized elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. In such a fragmented context, new voices began calling for reform and renewal, not just of leadership, but of the Persian imperial idea itself. One of the most significant of these figures was Ardashir, a local ruler from the province of Persis, known in earlier times as the heartland of Achaemenid Persia. Ardashir was the son of Pabag, a priestly official or local noble who had gained influence in southwestern Iran. The family claimed descent from the ancient kings of Persia and had maintained strong ties to Zoroastrian institutions. Unlike many other Parthian nobles, Ardashir did not simply seek power within the existing system. He aimed to replace it entirely. Ardashir's rise began with a campaign to assert control over neighboring territories. He expanded his power steadily, defeating other regional leaders and challenging Parthian authority directly. His military success was matched by his appeal to a shared Persian identity, rooted in Zoroastrian ethics and the memory of the Achaemenid past. The decisive moment came in the year 224 CE at the Battle of Hormozgan. Ardashir confronted Artabanus IV, one of the last Parthian kings, in a direct contest for the crown. Ardashir's forces prevailed, and Artabanus was killed in battle. With this victory, Ardashir declared the end of the Arsacid dynasty and the beginning of a new imperial order, the Sassanian Empire. The name Sassanian derives from Ardashir's claimed ancestor, Sassan, a figure associated with Zoroastrian religious authority. This link was not accidental. The early Sassanian state was deeply tied to religious legitimacy, promoting Zoroastrianism not merely as a personal faith but as a state ideology. Ardashir positioned himself as the chosen of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrian belief, and as the restorer of Persian glory. This restoration went beyond religious symbolism. Ardashir sought to revive and centralize imperial structures that had eroded under the Parthians. He reasserted royal control over the provinces, diminished the autonomy of noble families, and created a more hierarchical administrative system. The Sassanian court, unlike the Parthian one, was modeled on a strong monarchic center with clearly defined bureaucratic and military ranks. The fall of the Parthians and the rise of the Sassanians thus represented more than a dynastic change. It marked a reassertion of central authority, a revival of Persian imperial tradition, and a cultural shift that would define Iran for centuries to come. The Sassanians adopted many symbols of the Achaemenid past, royal titles such as King of Kings, iconography drawn from ancient carvings, and an emphasis on law and order inspired by Zoroastrian values. The transition also marked a turning point in foreign policy. While the Parthians had generally taken a reactive stance toward Rome, the Sassanians pursued a more assertive posture. They viewed themselves not as the heirs of a crumbling Eastern empire, but as equal rivals to Rome and guardians of a divine civilizational order. The stage was set for renewed conflict, one that would reshape the balance of power in the Near East. Yet the legacy of the Parthians should not be overshadowed by their fall. For nearly 5 centuries, the Arsacid dynasty had preserved Iranian sovereignty, protected Zoroastrian culture, and maintained a balance of power with Rome. Their decentralized model, while ultimately unsustainable in the face of new challenges, had allowed for remarkable resilience and cultural synthesis. The rise of the Sassanian Empire in the early 3rd century CE marked a new chapter in the history of Persia. After centuries of decentralized rule under the Parthians, the Sassanians established a strong, centralized state that sought to revive the glory of ancient Persia and elevate Zoroastrianism as a unifying state religion. Their rule would last for over 4 centuries and represent one of the most culturally vibrant and politically ambitious periods in Iranian history. Ardashir I, the founder of the Sassanian dynasty, wasted no time in asserting his authority after his victory over Artabanus IV. His early reign was marked by a series of military campaigns aimed at consolidating control over the Iranian plateau. He moved swiftly to bring rebellious provinces into line, subdued semi-independent noble families, and asserted royal authority over territories that had previously operated with considerable autonomy under Parthian rule. The reassertion of centralized control was not simply political, it was also ideological. Ardashir framed his kingship as a sacred duty ordained by Ahura Mazda, the chief deity in Zoroastrianism. In contrast to the more pragmatic religious tolerance of the Parthians, the Sassanians promoted Zoroastrianism as a state religion. This involved standardizing religious doctrine, codifying sacred texts, and elevating the priesthood to a prominent position within the state. Zoroastrian temples were built or restored throughout the empire, and fire, considered a symbol of purity and divine truth, became the central element of ritual practice. The high priest, or Mobedan Mobed, held a status second only to the king himself, and religious institutions were closely linked with state administration. This close alignment between throne and altar helped legitimize Sassanian rule and create a cohesive cultural identity across a diverse empire. Ardashir's successor, Shapur I, inherited a more unified realm and built upon this foundation with extraordinary ambition. Shapur continued the centralization process and expanded Sassanian influence beyond the Iranian plateau. He launched successful campaigns in the east, extending the empire's reach into Central Asia, and turned westward to confront Rome, which remained a persistent rival. The military conflict between the Sassanians and the Roman Empire became one of the defining features of the period. Shapur I scored a significant victory over the Romans in the mid-3rd century CE, capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, an event that shocked the Roman world. According to Sassanian sources, Valerian was taken prisoner and later used in forced labor projects, though Roman historians disputed some of these claims. Shapur immortalized his victory in monumental rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam and Bishapur, where he is shown triumphing over Roman emperors. These carvings, like those of the Achaemenids before him, served as public declarations of imperial power and divine favor. They also reflected the Sassanian commitment to shaping history through visual and symbolic means. Under Shapur, the Sassanians also demonstrated a remarkable openness to religious and philosophical dialogue. Despite their endorsement of Zoroastrianism as the state faith, Shapur invited scholars and religious leaders of various backgrounds to his court. One of the most notable figures of this period was Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, a syncretic religion that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Mani enjoyed temporary favor at court and even traveled with Shapur's armies, spreading his teachings. His emphasis on dualism, cosmic struggle, and spiritual liberation resonated with many, but ultimately clashed with the growing orthodoxy of the Zoroastrian clergy. Later, Sassanian rulers, particularly Bahram I, would persecute Manichaeans and other religious minorities in an effort to reinforce doctrinal unity. Despite these tensions, the early Sassanian period was marked by cultural vitality. The dynasty invested heavily in monumental architecture, court literature, and artistic production. Palaces with intricate stucco decorations, vaulted halls, and domed ceilings rose across the empire. Rock reliefs depicted scenes of royal investiture, hunting, and divine sanction, blending artistic sophistication with political messaging. The Sassanians also revived and preserved aspects of Iranian historical memory. Court historians and priests compiled chronicles that traced the lineage of Persian kings back to mythical and legendary ancestors. The idea of a continuous Persian monarchy stretching from the mythical Kayanians through the Achaemenids to the Sassanians became a powerful narrative, reinforcing both legitimacy and cultural pride. Economically, the Sassanian Empire benefited from its strategic location along key trade routes. It served as a central link between the Roman world in the west, the Indian subcontinent in the south, and the Silk Road networks that connected to China in the east. Sassanian merchants, craftsmen, and diplomats traveled widely, and goods from across the known world passed through Persian markets. The state supported infrastructure development, including road maintenance, bridge construction, and the establishment of caravanserais, inns that accommodated travelers and merchants. These investments facilitated commerce and enabled more efficient movement of troops and officials. To manage its increasingly complex society, the Sassanian state developed a structured bureaucracy. Officials were appointed to oversee taxation, justice, and provincial governance. While the king remained the supreme authority, the imperial administration relied on a hierarchy of ministers, judges, and local governors to enforce royal directives. Written records, seals, and legal codes became more standardized, reflecting the state's desire for order and uniformity. Social structure under the Sassanians was highly stratified. Society was broadly divided into four main classes: priests, warriors, scribes, and farmers. This division, while not rigid, reflected a worldview in which each group had a designated role to play in maintaining cosmic and social balance. Nobility enjoyed privileges and often held land, while artisans and farmers supported the economy through labor and tribute. Women in Sassanian society, particularly among the nobility, could wield influence in family and court affairs, though their legal and public roles were generally limited compared to men. Marriage alliances between noble houses were an important means of securing political power and consolidating wealth. Throughout the 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, the Sassanians consolidated their achievements. They had restored a powerful Persian monarchy, centralized administration, revived Zoroastrianism, and built a thriving economy and cultural landscape. Their statecraft combined elements of ancient tradition with practical innovations suited to the complexities of late antiquity. Yet, even as the Sassanian world flourished, new challenges began to emerge. Religious orthodoxy tightened, and dissenting views were increasingly suppressed. The growing power of the Zoroastrian clergy sometimes clashed with royal authority, while regional tensions and succession disputes simmered beneath the surface. The empire also remained locked in cycles of conflict with Rome, soon to be Byzantium, which would intensify in the coming centuries. These prolonged struggles, though often inconclusive, drained resources and tested the resilience of both states. Nevertheless, the early Sassanian era stands as a period of Persian Renaissance, a deliberate revival of imperial strength, cultural identity, and religious cohesion. It was a time when Persia reasserted its place as a dominant force in the ancient world, not only in military terms, but as a beacon of civilization and governance. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the Sassanian Empire had established itself as the dominant power in the east, while the Roman Empire had evolved into the Byzantine Empire in the west. What followed was a protracted and intense struggle between these two great civilizations, a rivalry that spanned more than 2 centuries. It was not merely a military contest, but a geopolitical and cultural duel, fought through battles, treaties, proxy wars, and shifting alliances. Though neither side would fully conquer the other, their long conflict would drain both empires and prepare the ground for a new era. The roots of this rivalry lay in centuries of Roman-Persian hostility, but the Sassanian period introduced new dimensions. Unlike the more decentralized Parthian state, the Sassanians were centrally organized, religiously unified under Zoroastrianism, and ideologically committed to the idea of a divinely sanctioned monarchy. Their rulers believed themselves not merely to be kings of Iran, but the defenders of truth, Asha, against chaos, Daruj, a worldview that gave political conflicts a cosmic weight. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire, likewise viewed itself as the center of civilization and Christian orthodoxy. Its emperors claimed universal authority, and its theologians viewed Zoroastrianism as a pagan rival. These ideological oppositions, Zoroastrian versus Christian, East versus West, amplified the already sharp political and strategic tensions between the two empires. Early Sassanian-Byzantine conflicts were frequent but localized. The empires often fought over the control of buffer states like Armenia and Iberia in modern-day Georgia. These regions were culturally mixed and religiously contested, and both empires sought to place sympathetic rulers on their thrones. When diplomacy failed, skirmishes and full-scale invasions followed. During the 5th and 6th centuries CE, a pattern emerged. Periods of warfare followed by negotiated peace. Treaties were signed and broken, tribute was exchanged, and prisoners were ransomed. The frontiers, particularly along the Euphrates and in the Caucasus, became heavily fortified. Persian cities like Ctesiphon and Byzantine strongholds such as Dara and Edessa became focal points of military operations. Despite the hostility, there were also moments of cooperation. For example, both empires faced internal religious dissent and external threats from nomadic peoples such as the Huns and various Turkic tribes. Occasionally, they coordinated efforts to manage these challenges. However, such cooperation was always temporary, quickly overridden by the deeper rivalry. The conflict escalated during the reign of Khosrow I, also known as Anushirvan, who ruled in the 6th century CE. Khosrow was one of the most capable and ambitious of the Sassanian kings. He reformed taxation, strengthened the bureaucracy, and invested in infrastructure, including the construction of new roads and bridges. His court became a center of learning, attracting scholars, physicians, and philosophers from across the known world. Khosrow also proved a formidable military leader. During his reign, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sought to expand his influence in the east while waging wars in the west. Khosrow exploited the distraction to press Sassanian claims in Armenia and Mesopotamia. The two empires engaged in multiple conflicts, including the so-called Iberian War and the Lazic War, both of which centered on control of strategic mountain passes and trade routes. Although these wars were grueling, neither side achieved a decisive victory. Eventually, both Justinian and Khosrow agreed to a truce, and a 50-year peace treaty was signed. However, the peace was short-lived. New Byzantine emperors, eager to assert dominance, reopened hostilities, and Khosrow's successors resumed the cycle of war. The most dramatic phase of the Sassanian-Byzantine conflict came during the early 7th century CE, under the reign of Khosrow II, often called Khosrow Parviz. His reign began with a Byzantine-backed coup that briefly displaced him. With military assistance from the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, Khosrow reclaimed his throne. In gratitude, he concluded a lasting peace and returned previously disputed territories. However, when Maurice was assassinated and replaced by the usurper Phocas, Khosrow used the event as a pretext to launch a massive invasion. The Sassanian armies swept through the Levant, capturing Damascus and Jerusalem, and even seized the relic of the True Cross, a powerful Christian symbol. They continued westward into Egypt, capturing Alexandria and securing control of the grain supply. At its peak, Khosrow's empire controlled more territory than at any time since the Achaemenid era. The Byzantines were thrown into crisis. Their empire was divided, bankrupt, and militarily overwhelmed. However, a new leader emerged. Heraclius, a general who seized power in Constantinople and launched a daring counteroffensive. Over several years, Heraclius reformed the Byzantine military, introduced new fiscal policies, and began a campaign that would turn the tide of war. Heraclius's campaign was not only militarily effective but psychologically strategic. He invaded Persian territory directly, sacked key cities, and even reached the sacred fire temples of Zoroastrianism. By bringing the war to Persia's heartland, he undermined Khosrow's authority and caused unrest among the Persian nobility. In the year 627 CE, Heraclius defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Nineveh. The victory shattered Persian morale and exposed the weakness of Khosrow's rule. Soon after, Khosrow was overthrown in a palace coup led by his son, Kavad II, who immediately sued for peace. The treaty that followed restored the borders to their pre-war lines and returned all conquered territories and relics, including the True Cross. But the damage to both empires was immense. Decades of war had exhausted resources, depopulated cities, and strained social structures. The Persian state, in particular, was left politically fragmented and economically fragile. After Kavad's brief rule, a series of weak and short-lived monarchs took the throne, further destabilizing the Sassanian regime. The rivalry that had shaped the region for centuries was coming to an end, but neither side would emerge as the true victor. Just as the Sassanian and Byzantine empires began to recover from their mutual devastation, a new force arose to the south, united Arab tribes under the banner of Islam. By the early 7th century CE, the once mighty Sassanian Empire stood precariously on the edge of collapse. Decades of costly warfare with the Byzantine Empire, internal revolts, dynastic instability, and overtaxed provinces had left Persia vulnerable. In this weakened state, the empire encountered a force unlike any it had faced before. An emerging religious and political power from the Arabian Peninsula, united under the teachings of Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad began preaching in Mecca in the early 7th century, few could have imagined that within a single generation, his followers would bring down one of the world's great empires. But the message of Islam, its call for monotheism, unity, and moral renewal, rapidly gained adherents among Arab tribes. Upon Muhammad's death, leadership passed to a series of caliphs who expanded Muslim rule beyond the Arabian heartland with remarkable speed. At first, the Arab Muslim forces focused their energies inward and on local rival tribes. However, once internal unity was achieved, the early caliphs, beginning with Abu Bakr and followed by Umar ibn al-Khattab, launched military campaigns that pushed beyond Arabia into the territories of the two great neighboring empires, Byzantium in the west and the Sassanian Empire in the east. The Sassanians, at this point, were no longer ruled by a strong central authority. The death of Khosrow II had unleashed a wave of dynastic struggles. In the span of just a few years, multiple claimants to the throne rose and fell. Royal power fractured, and the court lost control over the provinces. Local governors and aristocratic families began acting independently, making unified defense against external threats nearly impossible. The first major clash between the Muslim Arabs and the Sassanians occurred during the reign of Caliph Umar, whose leadership ushered in a period of coordinated and aggressive expansion. The Arabs had several advantages: highly mobile armies accustomed to desert warfare, religious motivation that energized their troops, and commanders who understood how to exploit Sassanian weakness. The Battle of Dekar, which occurred even before the full-scale invasions, had already demonstrated that Sassanian forces could be beaten by Arab tribes. Though small in scale, this skirmish emboldened the Arab tribes and laid the psychological groundwork for larger campaigns. In the year 633 CE, Muslim forces invaded Sassanian-controlled Iraq, then known as the province of Asuristan. The Persian governor, Rostam Farrokhzad, attempted to coordinate a response but was constrained by the political chaos in the capital. Initial battles, such as those at Namarak and Ulay, ended in Muslim victories, with the Sassanian forces struggling to regroup. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in the early 640s CE. Rostam Farrokhzad led the Sassanian army, which included war elephants and heavy cavalry, against a smaller but well-organized Muslim force under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The battle lasted several days and ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Persians. Rostam was killed and the Sassanian army collapsed. This battle was a turning point. It opened the gates to Ctesiphon, the imperial capital. The city, once a jewel of Persian grandeur, was abandoned and fell into Muslim hands without significant resistance. Its palaces, treasuries, and archives were taken over, and the fall of Ctesiphon symbolized the end of centralized Sassanian rule. Yet the resistance did not end there. The final Sassanian monarch, Yazdegerd III, a young and inexperienced ruler, fled eastward, hoping to rally support in the provinces of Media, Parthia, and eventually Khorasan. For several years, he moved from city to city, seeking to build an army capable of reversing the Arab advances. Local governors sometimes offered him sanctuary, but few had the resources or the loyalty to support a prolonged resistance. Meanwhile, Muslim forces pursued the retreating Sassanian remnants, capturing major cities along the way. The Battle of Nahavand in the mid-640s marked the effective end of organized Persian resistance. Known in later Islamic tradition as the Victory of Victories, this battle crushed the last major Sassanian army and cleared the path for Muslim expansion into the Iranian plateau. Yazdegerd III continued to flee eastward, eventually reaching Merv, a city in modern-day Turkmenistan. There, he hoped to regroup and perhaps find foreign allies, such as the Turks or Chinese, who might intervene on his behalf. However, his hopes were in vain. Local support faded, and in the year 651 CE, Yazdegerd was assassinated by a local miller, reportedly for his royal jewels and clothing. With his death, the Sassanian royal line came to an end, and Persia passed into a new era. The Muslim conquest of Persia was not merely a military transition, it was a profound civilizational transformation. The old Zoroastrian elite lost their privileged status, many temples were closed or converted, and the fire cult that had been central to Sassanian ideology entered a long period of decline. However, the change was not instantaneous nor absolute. In many regions, Zoroastrian communities continued to function for generations. Persian administrators and scholars were employed by the new Muslim rulers. Elements of Persian court culture, literature, and bureaucracy were absorbed into the Islamic Caliphate. The Umayyads and later the Abbasids would adopt many Persian customs, and Persian officials played major roles in the formation of Islamic governance. Furthermore, the Persian language, although initially displaced by Arabic in official domains, survived and eventually flourished once again. Middle Persian gave way to New Persian, which became a vehicle for Islamic literature, philosophy, and historical writing. Over time, Iran became a center of Islamic civilization, producing poets, scientists, theologians, and historians who shaped the Muslim world. While the political structure of the Persian Empire came to an end, the cultural and intellectual legacy of Persia did not disappear. In fact, it evolved, merged with the Islamic tradition, and re-emerged in new forms. Iranian identity, shaped by centuries of imperial history, religion, and language, continued to assert itself in the new world that followed. The fall of the Sassanian Empire in the mid-7th century CE marked the end of Persian political independence for several centuries, but not the end of Persia. Though Arab Muslim forces had dismantled the structures of imperial rule, they did not erase the legacy of the Persian empires that had come before. The influence of Persia, its administrative practices, religious ideas, artistic styles, and cultural memory, continued to shape the Islamic world and eventually the broader contours of global civilization. The first and most immediate impact of Persia's imperial legacy was felt within the newly emerging Islamic Caliphate. The Umayyads, who succeeded the Prophet Muhammad's initial successors, relied heavily on Persian bureaucrats, scribes, and local elites to manage the vast territories they now controlled. In regions such as Iraq, Fars, and Khorasan, the infrastructure and governance systems developed under the Sassanians remained largely intact, even if the ruling class had changed. This continuity was not accidental. The Sassanians had created a sophisticated model of state administration with hierarchies of officials, systems of taxation, and records in written form. The Muslim conquerors recognized the value of these tools and adapted them for their own purposes. Persian officials helped organize the Diwan, the administrative register that became central to Islamic governance. Language also played a significant role in the preservation of Persian influence. While Arabic became the dominant language of religion, law, and scholarship in the early Islamic period, Persian did not vanish. Middle Persian, the language of the Sassanians, gradually gave way to a new literary language, New Persian, written in Arabic script but infused with pre-Islamic vocabulary, poetic structures, and idioms. By the 9th century CE, Persian re-emerged as a powerful literary and cultural language under the Abbasid Caliphate. The eastern provinces of the Islamic world, particularly those in Iran and Central Asia, became centers of intellectual and artistic revival. This period saw the flowering of Persian literature, with poets like Rudaki and Ferdowsi drawing deeply from ancient traditions while expressing them in a new Islamic context. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, written in the late 10th and early 11th centuries CE, stands as the clearest example of this cultural revival. Composed in over 50,000 couplets, the Shahnameh recounts the mythic and historical past of Iran, from the creation of the world to the fall of the Sassanian Empire. While deeply Islamic in form and setting, the poem is rooted in Zoroastrian and pre-Islamic lore, and it served as a vehicle for preserving Persian identity in a changing world. Beyond literature, Persian ideas shaped the philosophical and religious life of the Islamic world. Zoroastrian dualism, with its emphasis on the struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, influenced Islamic theological debates. Concepts such as divine justice, the moral responsibilities of kings, and the cyclical nature of history found resonance among Muslim thinkers. The concept of kingship itself, Shahanshah, or King of Kings, did not disappear after the fall of the Sassanians. Instead, it was inherited and reinterpreted by later Islamic dynasties of Persian origin, such as the Samanids, Buyids, and eventually the Safavids. These rulers, though Muslim in faith, often drew on ancient Persian models of court ritual, ceremony, and legitimacy. They saw themselves not only as political leaders, but as guardians of a Persian cultural tradition that predated Islam. The architectural and artistic legacies of the Persian empires also endured. The grand palaces of the Sassanians, with their domes, vaults, and intricate stucco work, inspired later Islamic architecture. The layout of mosques, caravanserais, and public gardens reflected a blending of Arab and Persian styles. Decorative motifs from Achaemenid and Sassanian art appeared in ceramics, metalwork, and textiles produced across the Islamic world. Even the idea of empire, with its centralized administration, territorial ambition, and cultural pluralism, remained a powerful ideal. The Abbasid Caliphate, which moved its capital to Baghdad, close to the old Sassanian center of Ctesiphon, was in many ways a continuation of Persian imperial tradition under Islamic rule. The court life of the Abbasids, their ceremonies, and even their titles bore the mark of Sassanian influence. In Central Asia, the legacy of Persia extended through the Turkic and Mongol periods as well. Dynasties such as the Ghaznavids, Seljuks, and Timurids all adopted Persian as the language of high culture and administration. Persian poets, scholars, and scientists flourished in courts from Samarkand to Delhi, keeping alive the memory and intellectual vitality of ancient Iran. On a deeper level, the Persian empires, especially the Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sassanians, had demonstrated a model of governance that valued tolerance, adaptability, and long-term cohesion. They had ruled over diverse populations with different languages, religions, and customs, not by imposing uniformity, but by creating a shared framework of loyalty, law, and cultural exchange. This model profoundly influenced how later empires, from the Ottomans to the Mughals, understood the challenge of ruling diverse societies. The Persian experience showed that imperial strength did not depend solely on military might, but on administrative wisdom, cultural integration, and a vision of history that connected the present to a meaningful past. Even today, modern Iranian identity is deeply shaped by the legacy of the ancient Persian empires. National consciousness in Iran draws not only from Islamic tradition, but from the memory of Cyrus the Great, the grandeur of Persepolis, the resilience of Parthia, and the enduring influence of the Sassanians. Monuments, literature, and public discourse in modern Iran often reference these earlier eras, not as distant relics, but as foundational to the nation's historical continuity. Globally, the legacy of Persia lives on in the ideas it helped propagate. The notion of human rights, for instance, is sometimes linked, albeit anachronistically, to the Cyrus cylinder, an inscription from the 6th century BCE that declared religious tolerance and the restoration of displaced peoples. While the modern interpretation of such texts must be cautious, they reveal a long-standing Persian concern with justice, legitimacy, and the moral responsibilities of power. In reflecting on the entire arc of Persian imperial history, from the tribal beginnings of the Medes and Persians, through the rise and fall of the Achaemenids, the resilience of the Parthians, and the renaissance of the Sassanians, it becomes clear that Persia was never just a geopolitical entity. It was an idea, a vision of civilization that merged power with culture, diversity with unity, and continuity with transformation. Empires may rise and fall, but ideas endure. The story of Persia is not simply a chapter in the history of the ancient world. It is a thread that weaves through the fabric of world civilization, connecting past to present, east to west, and memory to identity. And in this enduring legacy, the Persian Empire continues to speak to us today.